My name is Professor Tahseen Jafry, and I am the Director of the Centre for Climate Justice at Glasgow Caledonian University. The last 6 years have been the hottest on record. The World Meteorological Organization have highlighted very clearly that we are currently off track to keep global warming to within 1.5 and 2 degree temperature height rise. We are currently on track to head towards 3 to 5 degree temperature height rise. The significance of this must not be underestimated. We will see significant environmental and socio-economic impacts, and this will be felt across many sectors. Food, in terms of food security, with the ensuing impacts of malnutrition and what that will mean on people's health. We will see species loss, and we will also see the onslaught of many natural disasters and an increase in incidents of extreme weather events. Certain populations will be at risk more than others, and certain parts of the world and regions will also be more at risk than others. The Arctic is a very vulnerable region, and with sea ice melting, it threatens the landscape of the region as well as the daily lives and livelihoods of Arctic populations, particularly the indigenous people. We also recognise that the impacts of climate change will be affected more by the poorest and the most vulnerable people in society, and thus, as such, we consider this an injustice. The Centre for Climate Justice have developed a definition of what we mean by climate justice, and we consider this to be humanity's responsibility for the impacts of greenhouse gas emissions on the poorest and most vulnerable people in society, by critically addressing inequality and promoting transformative approaches to address the root causes of climate change. We understand that climate justice historically is politically loaded and has been driven by social movements, but we at the Centre would like to consider ourselves as forward thinking and to try and take the political sting out of achieving a more climate and equitable world by trying to bring humanity together to look at those who are being affected most by climate change, no matter where they are in the world, and to develop policies and approaches that can really tackle some of the severe injustices that people are experiencing. We can't talk about climate change nowadays without considering what's happened in the world with the pandemic. So the coronavirus has hit all nations across the world, and it's hit hard. We have felt impacts socio-economically, politically and environmentally. We have seen, though, through the less travel and the reduction in industrial activity, a respite for the environment. Price of oil has come down, which is, it's unprecedented that we're seeing this now. But also the benefits are being felt in terms of cleaner air. We're seeing much less air pollution, especially in big cities such as Edinburgh, Cardiff, London, but also in big cities such as Beijing. Although the virus does not discriminate, we are also seeing that people who live in the poorest neighbourhoods, in overcrowded areas, and those who are not the healthiest and they're the most vulnerable are also suffering the most. So from a climate and coronavirus pandemic, it is the poorest people who suffer most from climate change, but it's also the poorest people who are suffering most from the pandemic also. So to combat this, particularly climate change, the world has set out ambitions to limit greenhouse gases and to prevent the worst impacts of climate change. And we know that with the Paris Agreement. The UK has set out ambitions to be carbon neutral by 2050, and in Scotland that target is 5 years earlier. But we're also seeing that in the Welsh Government that the targets to net zero have also been published. And so it's interesting that there is this race now that we're seeing within our devolved nations to see who is going to be able to reach these targets first, which is really quite interesting. To get to those reductions in targets, though, we need to follow a path towards that. And we're seeing much more talk and rhetoric around this terminology about a just transition. A just transition is an approach, it's a methodology that we need all of us to adopt to try and reduce our carbon emissions. But when we looked at all the kind of like definitions, we came up with this. Just transitions. It's a process of shifting to a low or zero carbon economy in a fair and equitable manner, with an emphasis on the rights and needs of fossil fuel industry workers and energy consumers. To arrive at that just transition, though, we are going to go through a number of hurdles. And in terms of the key debates and the challenges going forward, I would just like to highlight what a few of these are. So first up is the pathway to a just transition and what it means for our social economy. Overcoming our economy's path and dependency that we have and our reliance on the oil and gas sector is challenging. We in Scotland are dependent on the use of oil and gas and coal, and indeed we have the oil and gas sector based up in the north in Aberdeenshire. And so industry is reporting that if that sector was to shut down, we will be on track to lose around 260,000 jobs because it's those who are working in the offshore oil and gas industry. So it's quite considerable, and it will have a huge impact on the economy in that part of Scotland. But in terms of moving forward and to achieve that just transition, it's not just about decarbonisation, but it's about doing that transition fairly and equitably and in a manner that's going to provide a new focus and a new vision on how we live our lives. And much of this is about retraining and about the development of green jobs. And this is where the business of renewables comes in, because renewables are needed. They're much needed in our pathway to achieving a zero carbon economy. But there's much discussion about how we achieve the development needs of the renewables and in terms of the development of the technology itself, but the retraining and refocusing of the job sector is the challenge that we will need to embrace. So we will see the economic and social costs. It will be difficult, but I think we need to be visionary and find a way that we can address some of those obstacles going forward. Politically, it's the challenges are very clear. What we are seeing is the need to balance short-term economic growth with a long-term vision, and that's not easy to do. There is quite often we're hearing a lack of political will or public support for aggressive decarbonisation policies, and that's simply because of the fear of what it brings, of what it may bring in the short term, the fallout, the aftermath of sectors which depend heavily on a fossil fuel industry changing, and that change is what needs to be managed. And it needs to be thought through correctly, with a viewpoint of putting people front and centre of that change process. So the idea that I want to try and put forward here is the need to look at things holistically rather than short-termism, and move away from aggressive decarbonisation policies, which will have quick wins, but long term will be problematic. The technology itself is of issue. Obviously, the renewables sector is the way we need to be heading towards. But in terms of advances in technology, there is a cost to development of the right technology, but from a justice point of view, from a just transition point of view, it's ensuring that everybody has access to and has availability of the right technologies. And it's something that that I'm very cautious about, and very clear on the people who are benefiting from renewables just now. What I'm seeing is that we see the benefits of clean transport and green transport, trams replacing buses, but quite often we see that the benefits of those new green, clean technologies are city centre focused. And it's unfortunate because people who live in urban and rural areas don't have access or don't see the benefits of those renewable solutions going forward. So I think it's important that we see society as a whole, no matter where they live, and ensure that the technologies that we are promoting is accessible and available to all. I've got the picture there of an electric vehicle. Again, there is a push to promote electric vehicles. We're seeing it from all the car manufacturers just now, but it is a cost issue. And until the price of these electric vehicles come down considerably, they will be out of reach of the majority of people right now. Maybe that changes quickly over the next few years, which I sincerely hope it does. But the other issue about electric vehicles is the technology that's used to fuel them. So the battery is the most obvious thing, and the one issue with the batteries that supply and run these electric vehicles is a component called cobalt. It's a mineral that's mined in the Democratic Republic of Congo mainly, but in other parts of the developing world also. And it's quite often mined by child labour, so that's the picture that you can see there in the centre. So on the one hand, we are in a developed country. We would be very happy to drive around in an electric vehicle, but at the same time, are we destroying the lives and livelihoods of people in countries that are far, far away, and we don't recognise and we don't see, but who have contributed immensely in getting us access to getting these vehicles to us. So it's really mindful of knowing that. And then it's also thinking about to what extent we want to develop and invest in new kind of technologies. The image on the lower right hand corner is a visualization of a floating machine, which was conceptualized about sort of 10 years ago with funding from Bill Gates. And the machines turn seawater into tiny particles that can be shot up over 3,000 feet in the air. The particles increase the density of clouds by increasing the amount of nuclei contained within. And this is the most benign form of geoengineering compared to, for instance, fertilizing oceans with iron to increase carbon capture or spreading reflective aerosols in the atmosphere. So it's the scale of the technological challenge is immense, and it's being mindful of the investment that's needed to develop new technologies going forward. In saying that, none of this is going to be achieved without considerable financial support. Immense resources are required from global platforms to household levels to help us get access to low carbon technology. There's quite often a lack of agreement and regarding various incentives for developing new technologies, but also the divestment from fossil fuel companies is considerable. There's a cost involved in that, and obviously for any company looking into this, it will have implications on profits, on profit margins, and it's ensuring that those conversations are done in an ethical and a fair manner, and done in the right way and the right approach. But without financial commitment to addressing these issues, it's going to be hard to see how we can address them ourselves as individuals or as governments alone. Ensuring the transition is one part of the process, but we also need to ensure that it's not only effective, but it's also equitable. And there's two issues that I want to mention here: procedural justice and distributive justice. So to ensure the transition is fair and equitable, we need to consider and ensure that every stakeholder is recognised and meaningfully involved in any decision-making processes that affect them, their families, and what it means for them. In terms of distributive justice, is ensuring that the costs and benefits of that transition, so the technology that's developed and implemented, is fairly distributed among all people and not just the few. So these two things are really critical issues that underpin the journey to a just transition to a low carbon economy. So on this platform, what has been achieved so far? In Scotland, the Scottish Government set up the Just Transition Commission. It was established in 2018 to advise the Scottish Government on how to achieve a net zero economy that is fair for all. The Commission is guided by just transition principles that were created originally by the International Labour Organization. And those principles are to plan and invest in sustainable jobs, to address inequality and fuel poverty, and to design and deliver low carbon infrastructure which does not negatively affect the current workforce and the overall economy. So the recommendations of this commission will help Scottish ministers to maximise economic and social opportunities, building on Scotland's strengths and assets, and understand risks that could arise in relation to regional cohesion, inequalities, poverty and including fuel poverty, and a sustainable and inclusive labour market. So we have this Just Transition Commission in Scotland, and we're looking to see what recommendations are going to be made of that commission going forward. But it's really interesting to know that in Wales there's the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which is really encouraging. And also, I think what's really important here is the use of the word well-being, because I think that is really speaks to economic, social, environmental and cultural issues. And well-being is also linked to the mantra of the Sustainable Development Goals, as in leave no one behind. So if the Welsh Government are using terminology such as well-being, it means that the interests of people are front and centre of this act going forward. In terms of what has been achieved, though, we can learn from good case studies and examples from our European our neighbours in Germany. There's a particular project called Energiewende, and it's this project which helped Germany move from coal to renewable electricity, and how it addressed many of the challenges and opportunities of just transition. In 2019, Germany produced more electricity from renewable sources than from coal and nuclear power for the first time. And this is really, really interesting. The coal and steel production were major employers in the Ruhr region in Germany. At one point, it was the largest industrial site in Europe. But the economic dominance of these industries in the region has dramatically declined over the last 50 years. The lack of technical schools or universities and lack of economic diversity presented real challenges for the region as a workforce in a declining industry, and there was little opportunity to retrain or to find another job. But this was recognised by the mid-1980s, and there was a deliberate and sustained strategy to address this. Investment in infrastructure, particularly transport, schools and universities, and environmental protection followed. So diversifying the region's economic and employment base was critical, and investment from high-tech and knowledge-based firm service sectors and promoting local entrepreneurship followed. For example, I would like to say the transformation of Gelsenkirchen, which is a town that used to be dominated by the coal industry, is now turned into a solar city, and it's now one of the largest suppliers of solar energy in Europe. So the Ruhr is a unique example of a successful transition away from coal-dependent economy to a diversified economy. And it gives insights into the challenges, but also highlights the importance of a strong public sector and strong trade union support that was needed to get that project off the ground. So what I want to do is just finish up on looking at where some of the knowledge gaps are as I see them. I think we have limited understanding of the social, economic and political consequences of a just transition. We need to really understand if we are going to follow the approaches by other organisations such as our neighbours in Germany. We really need to learn from what they did, how they did it, what approaches they used, and what bottlenecks and challenges will face us in that same journey. There is currently limited evidence of how individuals adapt to the new energy system, so that's the new renewable system. We all understand that transitioning to renewables has a cost element. There are issues of fuel poverty that we really must consider and understand. And whether it's an issue of education or training or capacity building. We need to get to grips with who we need to share this information with and how we do that. But effectively, there's no blueprint for universally effective policies. And this is the context. We're all in this journey together right now, grappling with how we do it. And it's almost feels like a big societal experiment, which it shouldn't be. But in fact, we are all trying to learn from each other as to what works, why and how. So for me, I think the just transition in Wales, like I said earlier, they're good building blocks already in place. The Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, the Environment Act, and the Prosperity for All, a Low Carbon Wales 2019. These are all excellent platforms on which to build on frameworks for achieving a climate just transition. But we can learn from the consequences of closures of the coal mines that we've seen in Wales and the impacts and the aftermath that brought. Devastating though it was at the time, I think there are lots of lessons to be learned as to how things were handled then and how things should be done differently in 2020 and beyond. The challenges, as I see it, particularly in Wales, to achieving that net zero would be harder compared to other parts of the UK, simply because there's less opportunity for CO2 storage compared to a country like Scotland. Sheep and cattle farming is hugely important to the Welsh rural economy, and that has huge implications with reference to how we eat, our food sustainability, moving from an animal to a more plant-based diet, and what that will mean for the farming sector in the country. So there are lots of challenges ahead to be able to understand that. But I think getting people talking about the issue is really, really important. So in Wales, there's a higher share of emissions from industry than the rest of the UK, and Wales exports natural gas generated electricity to England as well. So there are many challenges ahead that are quite unique to Wales. So just to conclude, I think going to where I started about the transition to a fair and low carbon economy, I don't think we can achieve a fair a transition unless we look at some particular elements critically. Any approach that's adopted needs to be inclusive. We need an inclusive climate policy at both international and domestic levels. Inclusivity is really important. Inclusivity, voice and representation, in my mind, must not be overlooked. I think participation of everybody's voices is really critical. And at the end of the day, this is a human rights issue as well. At the end of the day, everybody has the right to a decent quality of life, and how that decent quality of life is achieved must not be underestimated. And we must also ensure that it's a fair platform for everybody, so no one is disadvantaged in the journey to a low carbon economy. I think we have to be mindful of not disadvantaging some. So this is not just for the few, but this is for all. And I think the only way to achieve the all is to work in an interdisciplinary manner and in partnerships with a wide range of stakeholders. This is not an exercise just for engineers to roll out. This involves sociologists, this involves social workers, this involves environmentalists, this involves everybody to be part of that conversation, if only to allow different perspectives to be part of that conversation. I think at the end of the day, all eyes will be on what happens in COP, which will be held, COP26, which will be held in Glasgow in November 2021. The significance of this is the fact that it's the 5th anniversary of the Paris Agreement. At that point, there will be a review of the nationally determined contributions and other commitments that all nation states are going to pledge by way of indicating how they're going to arrive at the journey to zero carbon economy and those ambitious plans that were set out earlier. I think from my perspective, one important thing is learning lessons from what happened during COP25, which was held in Madrid. We saw there that there were tensions between developed and developing nations, and that there's a lot of discontent amongst the financial status and the technological needs that need to be provided to poorer nations in the world to help them transition to this a low carbon economy. So it's not without its problems. So although we can recognize that this is a transition is something that we need to do in the developed countries, there is also this onus of responsibility, I would say, to help those nation states that don't have access to those financial resources and the technological advancements to help them move forward. So recovery plans post-COVID-19, and I say build back better. How do we build back better? I think there's some key elements that we need to, key questions that we need to ask of ourselves. Looking back at the challenges that there are in Wales, like I'd mentioned earlier on, I guess the question is looking at the situation as it is now and asking that very question, where do the opportunities lie and where are the risks, and how do you balance that out, if at all possible to do? And what would policies on a fair and climate just transition look like? What does that framework look like? And how do you start piecing that together? And the final question is, who are the stakeholders and who needs to be involved in this process? Do we consider climate citizens assemblies that we're seeing that were held with the UK at Westminster? They had the UK citizens, the Climate Citizens Assembly, so that people could raise their voices and understand the conversation. Perhaps that's a way to go, or maybe there are other ways to bring individuals on board through different platforms to have climate conversations. So there are many questions that I think need answers to. These are not easy questions to tackle, but I think they would be the starting point to build a framework on how to achieve a transition to a fair and climate just economy. So I hope that's provided a good overview as to what some of the issues are, and lots to consider and to think about.